They didn't just divorce her. They erased her. Vanessa Gregg had done everything right. Graduated top of her class, built a career, married into a family that promised her belonging. But when the fertility clinic confirmed what she'd feared for months, everything she'd built collapsed in a single afternoon. The diagnosis wasn't just medical. It was social execution. Her husband's family didn't yell. They didn't argue. They simply stopped seeing her. Invitations dried up. Phone calls went unanswered. At family gatherings, conversations shifted when she entered the room, as if her presence carried contamination. Her husband filed for divorce 3 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences. But everyone knew the real reason. A woman without a womb is a woman without worth. That's what his mother had said. Not to her face, never to her face. But loud enough, clear enough. Vanessa didn't beg. She didn't cry in public. She signed the papers, packed her things, and disappeared into a city that had already forgotten her name. But on a cold winter evening, sitting alone on the stone steps of a sleek modern building, her coat pulled tight, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air, Vanessa realized she had nowhere left to go. The people inside moved past the glass walls like ghosts in another world. She was outside. Invisible. That's when she felt it. The weight of someone's gaze. She looked up. A man stood at the top of the steps, hands in the pockets of a long black coat, his expression unreadable. He wasn't rushing past like the others. He wasn't pretending not to see her. He was watching her. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. With recognition. Li Dong didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, he said 6 words that would change everything. "You look like someone I need." Vanessa should have walked away. She should have told him to let her be. But when a man like Li Dong, a Korean mafia boss known for silence, strategy, and ruthless control, looks at you like you're not broken but useful, you listen. He didn't offer her love. He didn't promise healing. He offered her something far more dangerous. A place at the table. Protection. Status. Power. And a marriage that had nothing to do with children, and everything to do with survival. But in Li Dong's world, being his wife doesn't mean being safe. It means being seen. And once the underworld sees you, there's no going back. Rival syndicates will question her. Cultural stigma will hunt her. And Vanessa will have to decide. Will she remain a symbol in his shadow, or become a strategist at his side? Because Li Dong didn't choose her to save her. He chose her because she's the only woman who understands what it means to be cast out, and still stand up. And when the world tries to erase you twice, you stop asking for permission to exist. Vanessa didn't cry when Dr. Francisca told her the news. She sat quietly in the clean, cold office with her hands resting in her lap and listened as he explained that her condition couldn't be fixed. He mentioned medical terms, talked about how pregnancy wouldn't be possible, and said adoption could be an option someday. Vanessa nodded, thanked him, and even booked another appointment she already knew she wouldn't go to. She left the clinic holding her purse tightly and walking straight, because that was how she'd always been. She stayed composed. She didn't break down in public. Her husband didn't cry either. Trevor was waiting in the car, looking at his phone when she got in. He glanced at her and she slowly shook her head. That was all he needed to know. He started the car and they drove home without saying a word. The silence felt heavy and painful. That night he slept in the guest room. By the end of the week he had moved out. Before the month was over, divorce papers arrived from his lawyer. What Vanessa didn't expect was how fast everything else fell apart. Trevor's mother stopped calling first. There was no argument, no explanation, just silence. The woman who used to message her every Sunday with church times and recipes suddenly disappeared. Then Trevor's sister removed her on social media. After that, his cousin, who had been working out with her for years, was suddenly always too busy. One by one, people vanished from her life. It felt careful and deliberate, like she was being erased. The worst part wasn't being rejected. It was what people said behind her back. Vanessa had always known how society talked about women who couldn't have children, but she never thought she'd be one of them. She heard comments at the store, at work, at the salon. "That's so sad. I heard she can't have kids. What's the point of marriage if you can't give him a family?" It felt like her whole life had been reduced to one thing she couldn't do. As if her education, her career, and everything she had achieved meant nothing, just because her body had failed her. Here's what most people don't understand about infertility: it's not just grief. It's erasure. Society doesn't know what to do with women who can't fulfill the role they've been assigned since birth. You're not tragic enough to pity but not whole enough to include. You exist in this strange liminal space where people look past you, through you, around you, but never directly at you. You become invisible. Vanessa tried to keep working. Tried to maintain her routines. But her colleagues had started treating her differently too. The ones who knew, and somehow they all knew, would give her these tight, pitying smiles in meetings. Her manager stopped assigning her to client pitches involving family brands. As if infertility were contagious. As if being around her would somehow curse their own fertility. She'd been one of the top performers in her firm for 3 years running, but suddenly her ideas were getting dismissed, her emails went unanswered, her contributions overlooked. 6 months after the diagnosis, Vanessa realized she'd become a ghost in her own life. She'd stopped going to events where she might run into Trevor's family. Stopped answering calls from mutual friends who only reached out to ask intrusive questions disguised as concern. Stopped posting on social media because every photo felt like a lie. She'd moved to a smaller apartment across town, somewhere no one knew her story. She'd convinced herself that starting over meant disappearing completely. But starting over required having somewhere to go. And Vanessa had run out of destinations. That's why she'd been sitting on those steps that night, staring at the clinic appointment reminder still glowing on her phone. Dr. Francisca's office had called twice that week about the follow-up she'd canceled. They wanted to discuss next steps and emotional support resources. As if there were steps left to take. As if support groups and therapy sessions could fix the fact that the world had decided she no longer mattered. She'd been weighing her options. Leave the city entirely. Start over somewhere no one knew her name. Get a new job, build a new life, become someone without a past. Or stay. Keep pretending. Keep showing up to an office where people looked through her. Keep living in a city that had already forgotten she existed. The cold had seeped through her coat, numbing her fingers, but she hadn't moved. Somewhere behind the glass walls of the building, people were laughing. Networking. Building futures. She could see them through the windows, moving in warm yellow light like actors in a movie she'd never been cast in. That's when the presence behind her shifted. She'd felt him before she'd seen him. Felt the weight of someone's attention in a way she hadn't experienced in months. Most people's eyes slid right past her now. His didn't. Vanessa had looked up slowly, half expecting another stranger about to ask if she was okay, if she needed help, if there was someone they could call. The kind of concern that felt more like an accusation. Are you broken? Do you need fixing? Should you even be here? But Li Dong hadn't asked any of those questions. He just stood there, hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. Not cold but not warm either. Assessing. Calculating. Like he was looking at a chessboard and deciding where she fit. You're thinking about leaving, he'd said. Not a question. A statement. Vanessa's throat had tightened. You don't know me. I know that look. He'd tilted his head slightly. You're deciding whether you matter enough to stay. And that's when something inside her cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Because he'd seen it. The thing she'd been hiding from everyone, including herself. The quiet, suffocating question that had been eating at her for months. If she couldn't be a wife, couldn't be a mother, couldn't fulfill the role everyone expected, what was she for? Li Dong had taken one step closer. You do. Do what? Matter. Vanessa didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent 6 months being told, in 1,000 unspoken ways, that she didn't matter. That her value had expired the moment her reproductive system failed. And here was a stranger, someone who didn't know her history or her diagnosis or the shame that clung to her like a second skin, telling her the opposite. She'd stood up then, brushing snow from her coat, putting distance between them. You don't know anything about me. Li Dong hadn't moved. I know you're educated. I know you've been erased from something that mattered to you. And I know you're sitting outside in the cold because you can't decide if disappearing is easier than rebuilding. He'd paused, letting that sink in. I also know you haven't disappeared yet, which means part of you still wants to fight. Vanessa had walked away that night without giving him her name. But she'd thought about those words for days afterward. Part of you still wants to fight. Did she? She wasn't sure anymore. Fighting required believing you had something worth fighting for, and Vanessa had lost that belief somewhere between the divorce papers and the last unanswered text from someone she'd once called a friend. The city felt different after that encounter. Bigger. Lonelier. She'd go to work, sit through meetings where her voice seemed to echo in a void, then return to her apartment and stare at walls that never quite felt like home. She'd scroll through social media and see Trevor's new girlfriend, younger and glowing and very clearly not infertile, posing with his family at events Vanessa used to attend. She'd see former friends posting about their pregnancies, their baby showers, their growing families. Every notification felt like a reminder of what she'd never have. What she'd never be. Here's what they don't tell you about losing your place in the world. You don't just lose relationships. You lose your sense of self. For years, Vanessa had defined herself by her roles. Daughter, wife, future mother, professional, friend. But those roles had dependencies, They required other people to see you, acknowledge you, include you. When those people disappeared, the roles collapsed. And what was left? Just Vanessa. Alone. Undefined. A woman without context. She'd started avoiding places where she might be recognized. She'd stopped going to her usual coffee shop because the barista always asked about Trevor. She'd switched grocery stores after running into one of his cousins in the produce section. She'd even changed her route to work, taking side streets instead of the main road, as if physical distance could somehow protect her from the social death she'd already experienced. One afternoon, 3 weeks after meeting Li Dong, Vanessa found herself standing in front of a mirror in a department store dressing room. She'd been shopping for a blazer for an upcoming presentation, but the woman staring back at her looked like a stranger. Same face, same body, but somehow diminished, as if she'd been photocopied too many times and the image had started to fade. A saleswoman had knocked on the door. "How's everything fitting?" "Fine," Vanessa had said, even though nothing fit anymore. Not the clothes. Not her life. Not the version of herself she'd spent 32 years building. She'd left without buying anything. That evening she'd received a message from an unknown number. Just an address and a time. No explanation. No signature. But somehow she knew it was from him. Li Dong. The man who'd looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving instead of a problem to be avoided. Vanessa deleted the message right away. Then she brought it back. Then she deleted it again. For over an hour she paced around her apartment, telling herself that meeting a stranger, especially someone like Li Dong who carried a quiet but dangerous presence, was a bad idea. Careless. Possibly unsafe. But when you've been invisible for too long, you start wanting to be noticed in any way you can. Even if it's risky. Even if it doesn't fully make sense. Because being invisible isn't calm or peaceful, it's crushing. It's walking through busy places where people bump into you because they don't really see you. It's talking in meetings and realizing no one is listening. It's feeling like the world has already decided you don't matter. In the end, Vanessa went to the address. It was a restaurant in a part of the city she rarely visited. Classy but not flashy. Quiet. The kind of place where people spoke softly and seemed like they belonged there. The moment she stepped inside, she felt out of place. Her clothes too simple, her confidence thin. But the hostess knew her name and led her straight to a private booth at the back. Li Dong was already there. Same dark coat. Same calm, unreadable face. But this time, something about him felt different. He wasn't just watching her. He looked certain, as if he'd already made up his mind and was waiting for her to do the same. He didn't greet her. Didn't ask how she was. He just pointed to the seat across from him and said, "You came. That tells me something." Vanessa sat down slowly. "What does it tell you?" "That you haven't given up on yourself yet," he said, leaning back. "Your ex-husband's family erased you because they only saw biology. Your coworkers stopped respecting you because they tied fertility to ability. Society taught you that a woman's worth depends on whether she can have children." He paused. "But you don't fully believe that. If you did, you wouldn't be here." The words hit her harder than she expected, because they were true. If she had truly accepted what the world told her, she would have disappeared by now. Left the city. Changed her name. Started fresh somewhere no one knew her past. But she hadn't. Something inside her still refused to fade away. "What do you want from me?" Vanessa had asked. Li Dong had smiled then. Small. Almost imperceptible. "I don't want anything from you. I want to offer you something." "And what's that?" "A choice." He'd leaned forward slightly. "You can keep living like this. Invisible. Diminished. Waiting for the world to give you permission to matter again. Or you can walk into a different world entirely. One where your value isn't determined by biology or social approval. Where power is negotiated, not inherited. Where being underestimated is an advantage, not a sentence." Vanessa's pulse had quickened. "You're talking about your world." "I'm talking about a partnership." His gaze hadn't wavered. "I need a wife. Not for love. Not for children. For strategy. For presence. For the kind of legitimacy that comes from standing beside someone who refuses to be erased." He tilted his head slightly. "And you need a place where you're seen. Not as someone's ex-wife. Not as someone's medical failure. But as yourself. You don't even know me. I know enough." Li Dong had pulled out a card, sliding it across the table. "Think about it. But don't take too long. In my world, hesitation is dangerous." Vanessa had kept that card in her wallet for 3 days. She'd take it out during meetings, turning it over between her fingers like a talisman. Just a name, Li Dong, and a phone number. No company. No title. Nothing to indicate who he was or what he did. But she'd felt the weight of it every time she touched it, like holding a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. On the fourth day she'd called. The meeting location he'd given her wasn't what she'd expected. Not a restaurant this time. Not a public space where curious eyes could watch. Instead, he'd sent a car to pick her up from her apartment, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who hadn't spoken a single word during the 30-minute drive out of the city center. They'd ended up at a private estate on the outskirts, the kind of property that didn't advertise itself, hidden behind high walls and security gates that opened without the driver needing to announce their arrival. Li Dong had been waiting in a study that looked like it belonged in a different era. Dark wood paneling. Leather chairs. Shelves lined with books in Korean, English, and what looked like Mandarin. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Vanessa had sat, her pulse thrumming beneath her skin. "You came," he'd said. Not surprised. Just acknowledging. "I want to understand what you're actually proposing." Vanessa had kept her voice steady, even though her hands were clenched in her lap. "Because if this is some kind of... It's not." Li Dong had cut her off, but not unkindly. "I'm not interested in a mistress or a companion or whatever euphemism makes this easier to digest. I'm proposing a marriage. Legal. Public. Binding." Vanessa had stared at him. "You don't know me. You don't love me. Why would you want to marry me? Love is a luxury in my line of work. Marriage is a tool." He'd leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I run an organization that operates in gray spaces. Legal businesses on the surface. Less legal operations underneath. To maintain legitimacy, to navigate certain social and political circles, I need a wife. Not just any wife. Someone educated. Boys. Someone who can sit across from a prosecutor's wife at a charity gala and make her believe we're just another successful couple. Here's what most people don't understand about power. It's not just about money or muscle. It's about perception. The world judges you based on who stands beside you, who vouches for you, who shares your name. A man like Li Dong could own half the city's underground economy, but without the right social positioning, he'd always be an outsider. Dangerous, yes. Wealthy, certainly. But never legitimate. Never accepted. Marriage to the right woman could change that. Could open doors that money alone couldn't unlock. And what do I get out of this? Vanessa had asked. Protection. Status. Financial security. Li Dong had pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. A contract that guarantees you autonomy within the marriage. Separate living quarters if you want them. Control over your own finances. The freedom to maintain your career or pursue new interests. And most importantly, a position where you're seen. Respected. Where no one will ever make you feel invisible again. Vanessa had opened the folder slowly. Legal documents. Dense paragraphs of terms and conditions. But as she'd read, she'd realized this wasn't a trap. It was a negotiation. He'd outlined everything. Her role in public appearances, her boundaries in private spaces, financial arrangements that put significant assets in her name, exit clauses that protected her if things went wrong. This wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a business transaction with unusual stakes. "Why me?" she'd asked, looking up from the papers. "You could find someone else. Someone without my history. Someone who wouldn't raise questions. Your history is precisely why I chose you." Li Dong had stood, moving to the window that overlooked manicured gardens. "You've been discarded. Erased. You understand what it means to be judged on factors beyond your control. That makes you dangerous in ways most people aren't." "Dangerous how?" "You have nothing left to lose. No reputation to protect. No social circle to maintain. No family breathing down your neck about appearances." He turned to face her. "That makes you unpredictable. And in my world, unpredictability is valuable. People will underestimate you. They'll think you're just arm decoration. A placeholder. And while they're dismissing you, you'll see everything they're trying to hide." Vanessa had felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. For months, she'd been treated like her infertility had made her defective. Incomplete. Less than. And here was someone saying that her erasure, her outsider status, her lack of conventional value made her an asset. "There are risks," Li Dong had continued. "My enemies will target you to get to me. Rival organizations will test you to find weaknesses. Law enforcement will investigate you to build cases against me. This isn't a safe choice, but it's a visible one. You'll never be ignored again. And if I say no, then you go back to your apartment. Your diminishing career. Your disappearing act." He'd crossed his arms. "I won't contact you again. This offer expires tonight." Vanessa had looked down at the contract again. At the clauses that promised her agency. At the numbers that would make her financially independent. At the terms that treated her like a partner, not property. She'd thought about Trevor's family, about the colleagues who'd stopped listening to her, about the city that had turned her invisible. She'd thought about sitting on those cold steps, wondering if she mattered enough to stay. What happens if I can't do this? She'd asked quietly. What if I'm not strong enough for your world? Li Dong had moved back to his desk, sitting on the edge of it, closer than before. Strength isn't about enduring pain without breaking. It's about knowing when to adapt and when to stand firm. You've already survived erasure. Most people don't. They internalize the rejection, believe the verdict society hands them, and disappear into themselves. His eyes had held hers. You're still here. Still asking questions. Still negotiating. That's not weakness. That's strategy. She'd taken a breath. I need time to think. You have until midnight. He checked his watch. 4 hours. If I don't hear from you by then, the offer is off the table. Vanessa had stood, tucking the folder under her arm. And if I say yes? What happens next? We get married within the week. Quiet ceremony. Just legal witnesses. Then I introduce you to my world. Li Dong had walked her to the door. And you decide whether you're going to stand beside me as decoration or as an equal. The driver had taken her back to her apartment in silence. Vanessa had sat in her living room, the contract spread across her coffee table, and stared at the terms until the words blurred. This wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even particularly safe. But it was something she hadn't had in months, a choice. Not about whether she was valuable, but about what kind of value she wanted to claim. At 11:45 she picked up her phone and dialed his number. I have conditions, she'd said when he answered. I expected you would. I want access to everything. Financial records. Business operations. The truth about what you do. No secrets. Agreed. And if I decide this isn't working, I walk away. No retaliation. No threats. Already in the contract. Vanessa had closed her eyes. Then yes, I'll marry you. There'd been a pause on the other end. Then Li Dong had said, car will pick you up tomorrow at 9. Bring what matters. Leave the rest. The courthouse wedding lasted only 11 minutes. There were no flowers and no guests. Just a judge asking the usual questions and 2 witnesses Vanessa didn't know and would probably never see again. Li Dong wore a dark suit. Vanessa wore the same blazer she had almost bought weeks earlier but finally bought the day before. When the judge said they were married, Li Dong didn't kiss her. He only nodded, signed the papers and gently led her to the car, his hand barely resting on her lower back. That was 4 days ago. 4 days living in a penthouse that felt more like an art gallery than a home. 4 days of realizing that marriage in Li Dong's world wasn't about eating together, sharing coffee in the morning, or building small routines like she had with Trevor. It was about showing up, thinking ahead, watching people closely, people who smiled at you while secretly measuring your weaknesses. The first test came on the second night. Over breakfast, brought by staff whose name she still didn't know, Li Dong told her they were attending a dinner that evening. Business partners. Powerful people. She should dress well but not too flashy. Speak only when spoken to. Watch everything. Vanessa stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes and realized none of her clothes fit this new life. They were meant for office meetings, relaxed weekends, and dates with a man who eventually decided she wasn't enough. Nothing she owned said, wife of a man who works in the shadows. Li Dong fixed that by bringing in 3 designers with racks of clothes. She chose a deep burgundy dress. Simple, elegant, not attention-grabbing, but she still felt like she was wearing a costume. The dinner took place at a private club she never knew existed, hidden inside a building with no sign. The doorman recognized Li Dong instantly. Inside, the room was warm and softly lit, filled with men in expensive suits and women who wore their wealth like protection. Li Dong introduced her as, my wife, Vanessa, and she watched their faces change, surprise first, then judgment, then careful politeness. What people don't tell you about places where power matters most is this. Everyone is acting. Smiles are planned. Compliments have a purpose. Every conversation carries a second meaning. Without saying it, people are asking, who are you? Why are you here? What do you offer? And most of all, are you someone to fear, or someone to use? Vanessa had sat beside Li Dong, her hands folded in her lap, and had done what he'd instructed, observed. She'd noticed how the man across from them, Quan something, had glanced at her ring finger 3 times during appetizers, as if confirming the marriage was real. She'd caught the woman to her left, Isadora, watching her with the kind of scrutiny that felt like a test. She'd registered the moment when another guest, a lawyer named Vance, had asked Li Dong a question about expansion into new territories while his eyes had flickered to Vanessa, checking if she'd react. She hadn't. She'd simply taken a sip of water and waited. Li Dong had answered Vance's question with a kind of vague precision that revealed nothing while sounding cooperative. Then he'd shifted the conversation to art investments, a topic that got everyone talking about auctions and market trends and nothing that mattered. Vanessa had understood then what she was watching. Deflection. Control. The ability to command a room without ever raising your voice. After dinner, in the car ride home, Li Dong had finally spoken to her directly. You did well. I barely said anything. Exactly. He glanced at her. Silence is a language in my world. It says you're not desperate to prove yourself. That you don't need validation. That you're comfortable holding power without announcing it. Vanessa had stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. Quan didn't trust me. Quan doesn't trust anyone. But he'll test you. They all will. Li Dong had shifted in his seat. You're the new variable. They need to figure out if you're a liability or an advantage. And how do I prove I'm the latter? You don't prove anything. You let them underestimate you. Let them think you're decorative. While they're dismissing you, you learn everything about them. Their tells. Their vulnerabilities. Their alliances. He'd looked at her then, something almost like approval in his eyes. You already started tonight. I saw you watching. She had been. She'd cataloged the way Isadora had touched her necklace every time someone mentioned her husband's business. She'd noticed how Vance had checked his phone twice during dessert, always angling the screen away from view. She'd registered the tension between Quan and another guest whose name she'd already forgotten, the way they'd avoided addressing each other directly. The second test had come 2 days later. Li Dong had brought her to a meeting at a warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. No explanation. Just an instruction to stay close and say nothing. Inside, the space had been converted into something between an office and a command center. Men in casual clothes had been moving crates, checking inventory, typing on laptops. The air had smelled like oil and concrete and something metallic Vanessa couldn't identify. Li Dong had conducted business in Korean, his tone clipped and authoritative. Vanessa had stood slightly behind him, her face neutral, her body language relaxed despite the fact that every instinct screamed that she was in over her head. One of the men, younger than the others, had stared at her with open curiosity. Another had smirked like her presence was a joke he was in on. Here's what Vanessa had learned in that warehouse. Respect isn't given freely in spaces where violence is always an option. It's earned through composure. Through refusing to flinch when you should be afraid. Through standing in rooms where you're the only woman, the only outsider, the only person who doesn't belong, and acting like you have every right to be there. After the meeting, back in the car, Li Dong had asked her what she'd noticed. The younger one doesn't respect you yet, Vanessa had said. He's watching to see if you'll correct him. The man in the back, the one who didn't speak, he's the real authority. Everyone deferred to him without realizing it. Li Dong had smiled. Actually smiled. His name is Sung. He's been with me for 15 years. Runs operations I don't want visible. He turned to her. You saw that in under 30 minutes. I spent 6 months watching people pretend I didn't exist. You learn to read a room when no one thinks you're paying attention. Good. Li Dong had settled back into his seat. Because there's a dinner next week. Bigger stakes. Rival organization trying to negotiate territory. They'll bring their leadership. Wives included. He'd looked at her. They'll try to intimidate you. Insult you without saying anything actionable. Make you feel small. And what do you want me to do? Smile. Be gracious. Let them think they've won. Li Dong's expression had hardened. Then report everything they say to me. Every comment. Every look. Every assumption they make about who you are. Vanessa had understood then what her role really was. Not decoration. Not legitimacy. Intelligence. She was the person no one would suspect of being dangerous because society had already decided she wasn't worth watching. Her invisibility, the thing that had nearly destroyed her, had become her greatest asset in a world where everyone assumed they knew what a woman like her could do. The dinner with the rival organization had been scheduled at a restaurant Vanessa recognized from magazine features. The kind of place where reservations required 6 months of advance notice and connections most people didn't have. Li Dong had briefed her in the car on the way over, his voice low and measured. The Kozlov Group. Russian operations. They'd been encroaching on territory Li Dong's organization had controlled for years. This dinner was supposed to be diplomacy. A negotiation to avoid bloodshed. But both sides knew it was really about dominance. Dmitry Kozlov will bring his wife Irina, Li Dong had said. She's not decoration. She runs their money laundering operations through a network of galleries and auction houses. She'll assess you immediately. Try to find leverage. What kind of leverage? Anything that makes you a weakness instead of a strength. Li Dong had glanced at her. Your infertility. Your divorce. Your race. They'll use whatever they think will destabilize you. Vanessa's jaw had tightened. And if they do? You don't react. You smile. You redirect. You make them wonder if they've miscalculated. He paused. But if it becomes too much, you look at me. I'll handle it. They'd arrived at the restaurant to find Dimitri and Irina already seated. Dimitri had been exactly what Vanessa expected. Broad-shouldered, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Irina had been different. Elegant. Sharp-eyed. She'd watched Vanessa approach with the expression of someone evaluating a competitor, not a guest. The introductions had been formal. Handshakes. Pleasantries. Li Dong and Dimitri had engaged in the kind of careful conversation that sounded cordial but carried threat beneath every word. Vanessa had sat beside Li Dong, aware of Irina's attention like a weight pressing against her skin. "So you're the new wife," Irina had said in accented English, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Li Dong has always been so private. We were surprised to hear he'd married." "It was a personal decision," Vanessa had replied evenly. "Of course." Irina had taken a sip of wine. "Though I must say, it's unusual in our circles. Marrying someone without, how do I say this delicately, without established connections. Without family networks." Her gaze had been surgical. "You came from a previous marriage, yes? Here's what most people don't understand about social combat. It's rarely direct. It's about implications. About questions designed to force you into defending yourself, which makes you look weak. The moment you start explaining your worth, you've already lost." Vanessa had learned this in her former marriage, watching Trevor's mother dismantle women at charity events without ever saying anything actionable. "I did," Vanessa had said simply, offering nothing more. Irina's smile had tightened. "And that ended because?" "Because it ended." Vanessa had met her eyes. Some things run their course. Dimitri had laughed at that, a booming sound that had made other diners glance their way. "I like her. Direct." He'd looked at Li Dong. "You chose well. American women, they don't dance around topics like ours do." But Irina hadn't been satisfied. She'd leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something more intimate, more dangerous. "I only ask because in our world, marriages are strategic. They create alliances, produce heirs, establish dynasties." Her eyes had flickered down to Vanessa's flat stomach, then back up. "It makes one wonder what the strategy is when those traditional elements aren't possible." The table had gone quiet. Not silent, but the kind of quiet where everyone is suddenly paying attention while pretending not to. Li Dong's hand had stilled on his glass. Dimitri had glanced between his wife and Vanessa with something like anticipation. Vanessa had felt the old shame rising, the familiar ache of being reduced to her medical diagnosis. But she'd also felt something else. Anger. Not the hot, reactive kind. The cold, calculated kind. The kind that had been building for months, every time someone had looked at her like she was broken. Every time she'd been erased from conversations, from events, from the simple act of being seen as human. She'd set down her fork carefully, her movements deliberate. "You're right. Traditional elements aren't part of my marriage." She'd smiled then, the kind of smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Which means I have no competing loyalties. No children to protect. No family alliances to maintain. When I make decisions, I make them based solely on what serves my interests and my husband's. No divided attention. No compromised judgment." She tilted her head slightly. "In our world, as you call it, that's not a weakness. That's clarity." Irina's expression had flickered. Just for a moment. Surprise maybe. Or recalculation. Li Dong's hand had moved to Vanessa's knee under the table. Not restraining. Affirming. "Interesting perspective," Dimitri had said, his tone thoughtful now. "Most women in your position would have taken offense." "I'm not most women." Vanessa had picked up her wine glass. "I'm the one sitting at this table." The rest of the dinner had proceeded with careful politeness, but the dynamic had shifted. Irina had stopped probing. Dimitri had addressed Vanessa directly several times, asking her opinions on art, on the city, on nothing that mattered, but in a way that signaled he saw her as more than set dressing. Li Dong had negotiated the territorial dispute with his usual precision, and by dessert, they'd reached a temporary agreement. Lines would be respected. Operations would stay separate. War would be postponed. But as they'd left the restaurant, Vanessa had caught the look Dimitri had given Li Dong. Respect, yes. But also reassessment. As if Li Dong had revealed a new weapon Dimitri hadn't anticipated. In the car, Li Dong had been quiet for several blocks. Then he'd said, "You turned that around. She was trying to make me defensive. Make me small. And you didn't let her." Li Dong had looked at her. "You used your position instead of apologizing for it." Vanessa had stared out the window. I'm tired of apologizing for things I can't control. They'd almost made it home when Li Dong's phone had buzzed. He'd glanced at the screen and Vanessa had seen his expression change. Not fear. Something colder. He'd made a call, speaking rapid Korean, his tone sharp. When he'd hung up, he'd leaned forward and given the driver different instructions. What's wrong? Vanessa had asked. Kozlov's people hit one of our operations tonight. While we were at dinner. Li Dong's jaw had tightened. The negotiation was a distraction. They wanted to see if we were vulnerable. Are we? No. But they tested the boundaries. He'd looked at her. And now I have to respond. Publicly. In a way that makes it clear what happens when someone crosses me. Vanessa had understood what he meant. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. And she wasn't just Li Dong's wife. She was a piece on the board that Kozlov had tried to eliminate by making her feel insignificant. By making Li Dong look weak for choosing her. What do you need me to do? She'd asked. Li Dong had studied her for a long moment. There's an event next week. Gallery opening. Every major player will be there. Including Kozlov. He paused. I'm going to claim you. Publicly. No ambiguity. No room for anyone to question whether you're temporary or symbolic. And that will make me a target. It already has. His eyes hadn't left hers. But it will also make you untouchable. Because touching you means going through me. Vanessa had taken a breath. Then do it. The gallery opening had been billed as a celebration of contemporary Asian artists, but everyone knew what it really was. A gathering of power. The kind of event where alliances were displayed, territories were acknowledged, and respect was either given or withheld in front of witnesses who would carry the story forward. Vanessa had spent the week preparing, not with Li Dong's designers this time, but on her own terms. She'd chosen a black gown that made her feel like armor, elegant but commanding. She'd had her hair styled simply, pulled back to expose her face completely. No hiding. No softness. Li Dong had met her at the base of the penthouse stairs, and for the first time since they'd married, she'd seen something shift in his expression. Not attraction exactly. Recognition. He'd nodded once, a gesture that felt like approval, and had offered his arm. Ready? Vanessa had taken it. Yes. The gallery had been packed. Art on the walls that Vanessa suspected nobody was actually looking at. Champagne flowing. Conversations happening in clusters, each one a negotiation disguised as small talk. She'd spotted Dmitri and Irina near the back, watching the entrance like sentries. Kwan had been there with associates Vanessa was starting to recognize. Sung had been positioned by a side exit, his presence quiet but weighted. And scattered throughout the space had been others. Lawyers. Accountants. The people who made criminal enterprises look legitimate on paper. Li Dong had guided Vanessa through the crowd with his hand at the small of her back, stopping to greet people with a measured courtesy that revealed nothing. But Vanessa had felt the tension building. The way conversations had paused when they approached. The way eyes had tracked their movement. Everyone was waiting for something. They'd made it halfway through the gallery when Dmitri had intercepted them, Irina trailing behind with that same assessing look she'd worn at dinner. Li Dong. Vanessa. Dmitri had nodded to each of them. Beautiful event. Though I suspect the art is secondary to the networking. As it always is, Li Dong had replied smoothly. Dmitri's smile had sharpened. I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding last week. The incident at your operation. My people were acting on outdated information. It won't happen again. Here's what Vanessa had learned about power dynamics in Li Dong's world. Apologies are never just apologies. They're tests. Dmitri was checking if Li Dong would accept the gesture and move on, or if he'd push back and escalate the conflict. Both options carried risk. Accepting made you look weak. Pushing back could trigger war. The real skill was in finding the third option nobody saw coming. Li Dong had smiled, the expression cold and controlled. I appreciate the clarification. Though I think we both know information is rarely outdated in our line of work. It's either accurate or deliberately misleading. He paused. I'm sure you can understand why I'd want to make my position very clear going forward. Dmitri's smile had faltered slightly. Of course. That's when Li Dong had done it. He turned to Vanessa, his hand moving from her back to her waist, pulling her closer in a gesture that was both possessive and declarative. Then he'd addressed the entire room, his voice carrying with the kind of authority that made conversation stop mid-sentence. I'd like to take a moment to properly introduce my wife. Many of you have met Vanessa already. Some of you have assessed her, tested her, tried to find weaknesses you could exploit. The gallery had gone completely silent. Vanessa had felt every eye in the room lock onto her, the weight of their attention almost physical. Her instinct had been to shrink, to make herself smaller, to apologize for taking up space. But she'd fought it. She'd lifted her chin and met the gazes staring back at her with the same unflinching presence she'd learned sitting in that warehouse, standing beside Li Dong while he conducted business in languages she didn't speak. What you should understand, Li Dong had continued, his tone measured but unmistakably threatening, is that Vanessa isn't a vulnerability. She's not a placeholder. She's not a decision I made lightly or one I'll reconsider under pressure. He glanced at Dimitri, then at others scattered throughout the room. She's my wife, my partner. And any disrespect shown to her will be treated as disrespect shown to me, with all the consequences that entails. Vanessa had watched the room absorb that declaration. Some faces had gone carefully neutral. Others had shown surprise. Irina's expression had flickered with something that might have been grudging respect. But it was Kwan's reaction that had mattered most. He'd nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement that rippled through his associates like a signal. Li Dong had turned to Vanessa then, his voice dropping to something more intimate but still audible to those nearby. You've proven yourself in every situation I've put you in. You've shown intelligence, composure, and strength that most people in this room don't possess. His eyes had held hers. I chose you because I saw what others missed. And I'm claiming you publicly because you've earned that recognition. Here's what people don't tell you about being chosen. It only matters if you choose yourself too. 4 months, Vanessa had been waiting for someone to validate her existence. To tell her she mattered. To prove she had value beyond the biological function she couldn't perform. But standing in that gallery with Li Dong's declaration hanging in the air and dozens of dangerous people watching her response, Vanessa had realized something fundamental. She didn't need his claiming to make her legitimate. She'd already legitimized herself. Every room she'd entered. Every test she'd passed. Every moment she'd refused to apologize for existing. Vanessa had placed her hand over Li Dong's where it rested on her waist. Then she'd addressed the room herself, her voice steady and clear. My husband is right. I'm not a weakness. I'm not someone you can use to destabilize his organization. I'm not someone you can dismiss because I don't fit your traditional expectations. She'd let her gaze sweep across the faces staring back at her. I'm someone who's been underestimated my entire life. By families. By colleagues. By a society that decided my value based on things I couldn't control. And I've learned that being underestimated is the most powerful position you can occupy. Because while you're dismissing me, I'm watching. Learning. Understanding exactly who you are and what you're hiding. She'd felt Li Dong's hand tighten slightly on her waist. Approval. Partnership. The acknowledgement that she wasn't just accepting his claiming. She was claiming herself. So yes, Vanessa had continued, I'm Li Dong's wife. But I'm also my own person. With my own agency. My own intelligence. My own power. She'd smiled then, the expression genuine for the first time all evening. And anyone who forgets that will regret it. The silence that followed had been different from before. Not shock. Recognition. The room had just watched a woman who'd been socially executed 6 months ago declare herself untouchable. Not because of her husband's protection, but because of her own refusal to stay erased. Dimitri had laughed, breaking the tension. Well, that's clear enough. He'd raised his glass. To clarity. Others had followed suit, the gesture rippling through the gallery. A toast. An acknowledgement. A reset of terms. As the evening had continued, Vanessa had noticed the shift. People approached her directly now, not as an afterthought to Li Dong but as someone worth engaging. Sung had nodded to her from across the room, a small gesture that meant more than words. Even Irina had sought her out later, offering a business card and suggesting they meet for coffee. I misjudged you, she'd said simply. That doesn't happen often. When they'd finally left the gallery, after hours of strategic conversations and careful positioning, Li Dong had helped Vanessa into the car and settled beside her. For a long moment, neither of them had spoken. Then he'd said, You didn't need me to claim you. You did that yourself. Vanessa had looked at him. I needed to hear you say it, not because I doubted myself, but because I needed everyone else to know where you stood. And where do you stand? She'd considered that. 6 months ago, she'd been sitting on cold steps wondering if she mattered enough to exist. Now she was sitting in a car beside a dangerous man, having just declared her own power in a room full of people who could destroy her if they wanted to. I stand beside you, she'd said finally. Not behind you. Not beneath you. Beside you. Li Dong had smiled. Good. You just watched Vanessa refuse to stay erased. Now ask yourself, when are you going to stop apologizing for existing? How many more rooms will you shrink in? How many more times will you let someone else define your worth? Vanessa was told she had no value. She believed it for 6 months. Then she stopped waiting for permission. So what about you? You're still here. Still reading. That means something in you knows you're capable of more. Don't let this be just another story you forget tomorrow. Let it be the moment you decided you matter, not because someone chose you but because you chose yourself. If this story hit you, subscribe and share it. Someone needs to hear that being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's power waiting to be claimed.